So before we get into the meeting, I would like to acknowledge that where I'm presenting from and recording from is the land of the Kaurna people, and pay my respects to elders past and present who continue to hold a deep and spiritual connection to the land. I think in a meeting like tonight, it's extra important to be acknowledging where we come from, and where we that we are on unceded stolen land, because that plays a really important part in anti-racism work. Um, so essentially, the session today is really to support you to learn about this new resource that we've developed called Education, Action and Change, an anti-racism resource for schools and preschools. And that is for anybody really working in education from early childhood all the way to secondary school and honestly beyond. We see this resource as having impacts further than education within your local communities, as the activities and the learning within it is simple and easy to understand so that you can begin your anti-racism journey. So I wanted to give everybody just a short bit of background about the resource, and kind of how we ended up with this book. So the first thing that I think is really important to acknowledge is that beautiful artwork that you can see on the front of the book. So that artwork was developed by Marley Isabel, and we gave her a brief to do a commissioned piece of art, something that would speak about racism, that would help us to understand the kind of future that we want to see, and really something that should convey hope and could convey like a future without racism. And so the artwork is called Together We Can. And in Marley's words, together we can is not only a story, but it is a call to action. Together we can create a world where everyone is treated with respect. Together we can put an end to racism, and together we can create a better world for all. And I think that's a really good tone to start the workshop. Well, the meeting today is that it's really about us taking action and working together to create a better Australia in which we can all live in harmony with each other and without racism. So, so the background of the resource, just to let people know, Reconciliation South Australia have always offered anti-racism programs in schools and early learning sites, as well as across workplaces, in sports. And they went under review in 2023. And part of, I guess, that process was what would happen in replace of maybe some of those things that we weren't doing anymore. Um, what we found was that a lot of people wanted a guidebook or some support of how to do anti-racism within their sites and within their education sites. Um, and this worked out to be really serendipitous because in 2020, we actually formed an anti-racism subcommittee at Reconciliation South Australia. So we had kind of high level people working across all the education sectors, to come together and talk about how we could work towards a society that was free of racism and what sorts of things needed to be in place for educators, teachers and other staff members working within the education sector. And one of the main things that came out of that was this kind of guide or a resource that every school could have a copy of and could use that to implement anti-racism within their sites. We then held some focus groups with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people specifically, so those working in the education sector in either I guess, head office roles or positions where they're working in schools, where they're in support positions, Aboriginal community education officer positions, to look at the content and also look at how this work should be delivered in culturally appropriate and psychologically safe ways. Um, and then finally, we worked with the Australian National University to ensure that what we put in this resource was up to date and was relevant, and had, good kind of current articles, literature that we were referencing, and we're making sure that we were hearing from, academics and what they thought needed to happen. And we also worked with Jasmine Miller, who we'll be hearing more from later, who we kind of name in the document as a cultural editor. But what I will say is that Jasmine contributed far more than just editing. It was definitely a collaboration, and many contributions in this resource come from Jasmine's knowledge, both as a teacher and as an Aboriginal woman working with children, parenting her own children as well. And maybe it's probably a good pause actually to just invite Jasmine in, and maybe if you don't mind, just talking a little bit about your contribution and your process of participating in the resource development.
Sure. So thanks, Natalie. My name's Jasmine Miller. So I'm a proud Wurrungu, Gukutha and Mirning woman from Sejuna on the far west coast of South Australia, now living on Kaurna country. My background is education. So I've been working in education for the last 14 years, and most recently as a primary school teacher here on Kaurna country as well. Being asked to, I guess, be the cultural editor for this resource, but also, provide input into this, having those first-hand experiences, particularly as a teacher and, growing up in a regional community as well, and then also coming to Adelaide to finish off my secondary schooling. We know that racism is prevalent within schools, and, what can we do to mitigate, but also ensure that our classrooms, our educational settings are safe, and teachers are provided with resources that support them with creating, creating a classroom or a site that is anti-racist. And, there's not a lot out there, particularly, when we're looking at the early years, primary and secondary, there's nothing, I guess, tangible that teachers can pick up that really supports them, in what they're going to talk about in the classroom or the language that's used. And, being able to be a part of the development of something like this, especially when we know, how many times, Aboriginal children and young people, they experience racism and the harmful ongoing effects of that as well. So, it meant a lot to me to be a part of this resource and to provide, being a mother myself, my own personal experiences, but also, my knowledge from an educational background on what would be best suited, particularly in those year groups as well.
Thanks, Jazz. Yeah, and I mean, Jasmine's contribution to this resource cannot be understated, and I think really practical and advice for the resource of how it can be really accessible. And that was a really kind of clear early brief with development of this resource. Is we wanted something that is obviously not going to change the world, is simple, is easy to read, is just a starting point for anybody who maybe hasn't considered how racism is impacting their education settings, and more importantly, their Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, and how they might be engaging in the education sector and system without that kind of focus on being anti-racist as a school, as an early learning site, and as teachers and educators. So the resource is free and can be downloaded on the Reconciliation South Australia site by anybody really working in education, anybody who just is interested in anti-racism education. It specifically explores and how you can begin to build your understanding on how racism specifically impacts Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So we wanted to create a resource that kind of explored the unique racism that is experienced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia because of colonization, because of invasion, and because of historical legacies and decision making that impacted communities when they happened and then continue to impact Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. So the resource then is divided into three parts in order to help people to understand. So first is really understanding what racism is, how it's defined, and how we as Reconciliation SA have defined it in order to make it simple and understandable for sites. We also want to ensure that people understand the history of racism and racist decision making, racist policies, and the legacies of that, and how they impact Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So that's education. Then action is really about, well, then what is anti-racism and how do we plan for anti-racist education? How can we call out racism when we see it? So the action section has things like conversation guides and systemic racism guides. So how you can start kind of practically identifying, acknowledging, and then addressing racism within your sites. And then finally, change is a curriculum guide. And that curriculum guide goes from early years all the way to secondary schools. It's non-prescriptive. It does link to the Australian curriculum and the early years learning frameworks, My Time, Our Place, and the 3Bs. But it really is about simple kind of activities that you can grab out of there and begin to use within your sites. But also for those of you that are really confident and want to build upon them, they're really easily built upon. So you can extend and expand them based on your knowledge and the more things that you learn. Or if this is really kind of new and scary work, you can kind of just start with the basics. And we look at this from like a foundational all the way to secondary school, that ideally, if you were to follow the journey of a student from their early years in education all the way to secondary school, participating in all these activities, you would be building a person with the capacity to be anti-racist, to address racism when they see it, and understand the complexities of our history and of racism in this country. So I just wanted to play you a video. So in as part of our engagement in this work, we engaged with Luke Carroll as the ambassador for our Education Action and Change resource. So we decided to work with Luke based on his ongoing advocacy for anti-racism within both the sporting sectors and also within education, really working with children. So his work on Play School has been particularly transformative, where he's been able to advocate for two major episodes of Play School that some of you may have seen. So the first is a really short, sharp and shiny episode about racism and explaining what racism is in age-appropriate ways in which, you know, families and teachers can then have those conversations with children as well. And that has like a learning guide that goes with it that you can find online. And the second episode he did was an acknowledgement of country episode, where they introduced an Aboriginal character to the set in a doll called Kaya. And both of those episodes, he was really vocal about them being a part of this, and I guess explaining to the producers and the people that he was working with how important embedding Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledges, cultures, and ideas is really important on a show that so many Australian children consume and watch every day. So I just wanted to play you some words from Luke.
Hello, I'm Luke Carroll, a proud Wiradjuri and Ngunnawal man. And I'm also proud to be the ambassador for the Education Action and Change, an anti-racism resource for schools and preschools. In a world where diversity should be celebrated, It is essential that we cultivate anti-racism values in children and our young people. They are the future leaders, the change makers, and the influencers who will shape our society into the future. By instilling in them a strong foundation of anti-racist principles, we can pave the way for a more inclusive and equitable world. Children have an innate curiosity and openness to learning, making it the perfect time to introduce them to the importance of eradicating racism. By teaching them about different cultures, traditions, and histories, we can foster empathy, respect, and appreciation for diversity. It is through education and exposure that we can challenge stereotypes and biases, creating a generation that actively rejects racism. Young people in particular have the power to drive social change. They possess a unique ability to question the status quo, challenge injustice, and advocate for a more equitable society. By empowering them with the knowledge and tools to confront racism, we enable them to become agents of change within their communities and beyond. Their voices and actions can inspire others, creating a ripple effect that can transform our society. Eradicating racism is not only a matter of moral responsibility, but it is also crucial for the well-being and progress for our society. Racism perpetrates inequality, it restricts opportunities, and it undermines social cohesion. By dismantling racism, we create a society where every individual can thrive, regardless of their race or ethnicity. This not only benefits marginalised communities, but enriches us all, as diversity brings forth new perspectives, ideas, and innovations. Moreover, teaching children and young people about anti-racism fosters a sense of belonging and inclusivity. It empowers those who have experienced discrimination to feel seen, valued, and supported. It also cultivates a culture of acceptance and understanding, where individuals are judged based on their character and contributions rather than their race. As adults, it is our responsibility to model anti-racist behaviour and create an environment that encourages open dialogue about race and discrimination. By engaging children and our young people in these conversations, we equip them with the tools to challenge prejudice, stand up against racism and injustice, and build bridges of understanding. By nurturing anti-racism in children and our young people, we are investing in a future where equality, justice, and respect are the norm. It is through their actions, compassion, and commitment that we can create lasting change and dismantle the barriers that continue to divide us all. Let us join hands to shape a society that celebrates diversity, rejects discrimination, and embraces the beauty of our differences. Together, we can build a world where racism has no place, and where every individual is valued for who they are. A massive congratulations on the resource, and I look forward to seeing more education sites engage in anti-racism education.
I think it's really important to acknowledge with Luke's video there as well that in a lot of situations when someone asks for an ambassador to come on board, it would be our responsibility to write the words that they maybe spoke in a video like that. But we were really clear that we wanted to hear Luke's perspective on the state of racism and anti-racism within Australia. And so that speech was written entirely by him. And I think it's really important to hear those perspectives, particularly from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples when we are talking about anti-racism experienced by those communities. So I just want to give you a little bit of an overview of what's happening in South Australia. And for those of you that are joining us from other states or viewing this later, these are also some potential things to consider with how you can use this resource moving forward. So in South Australia, we're actually engaging in workshop content that now expands on the content of the resource. We're doing 35 workshops this year through a funding model, but those workshops just look at deepening understanding of the impact of racism in Australia, planning for anti-racism insights, including the development of an anti-racism strategy. They also look at student-led anti-racism work and policy review as well. And we'll be offering this as an ongoing fee-for-service model once that funding has run out. But essentially what we're looking at here is how we can continue to engage education sites in anti-racism work beyond the resource. The main thing, I guess, to note in this work is that we are doing a South Australian-based workshop content, and each state would have their own state-based content depending on how racism looks within those states, what's happening with your own localized communities, and being really clear that things might look different depending on your audience and depending on what's going on in terms of current affairs and issues as well. The second part of this work that we're kind of engaging in is an evaluation. And again, this is something that we really encourage people to think about if you are utilizing the resource. So we're measuring like our workshops to see how they work, but more importantly and more broadly, we actually just want to look at what's working and what isn't working when it comes to anti-racism work. So is the resource effective on its own? What sorts of teacher and educator capacity and confidence there is out there for addressing and teaching about anti-racism. And then we want to look at for recommendations for anti-racism education. So what are the barriers and what sort of recommendations do we need to put in place to ensure that anti-racism is prioritised within education sites and that it's continually worked on. So we are doing like a really large scale South Australian evaluation this year in collaboration with the Australian National University to find out a bit more about what educators know. And that's definitely something we suggest as you start to use the resource, is how you can potentially start to find out some data and some, what's happening out in your communities as well. So I'm just going to stop screen sharing for a little bit. I have one more video that I'll play later, but I wanted to now throw to Jasmine, who we're so lucky to have online this afternoon. Now is really, I guess, your opportunity as well in the meeting to ask some questions in the chat as well. But I've also got some pre-prepared. And so, Jasmine, I guess I'll just throw straight to you. Why do we need to talk about racism in education?
I think, racism starts from a young age. And, personally, I think, racism is taught. And, it's that those behaviors that are learnt by those who are older, than our younger people. And, I think educators, particularly teachers within education, we have, the tools, but also the ability to be able to educate and also provide these opportunities for learning as well. And, it's so important to understand those differences and how that impacts specifically Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, but also how it's affected Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people over time as well, and how, to this very day, there are many of us and the younger generation who still feel the ongoing effects from systemic racism, or racism in the community, or racism within schools as well. So it's really important to learn about these effects and how it can impact, because children might hear something, they might pick up some terminology that they haven't heard before, and they're going and spreading it within the schoolyard. And the perfect time to learn about racism and racism is at schools, because, you know, that's where children spend the most of their time, and, you know, teachers have that real ability, but also, you know, to have those conversations. And I think in those safe environments as well, and, you know, it allows for dialogue to happen, but also, you know, I think it's that understanding, and you know, what can you do to also call out racism if you hear it? So if you're a student and you hear someone making a racial comment, you know, what do you do in that instance? And I think, you know, if we're teaching, you know, our primary school students to call out racism when they hear it, you know, we can stamp out racism. And, you know, like it starts with our younger generation.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I probably would just extend on that from our perspective, is that systemic racism happens in education as well, and schools and well, education settings can perpetuate racism through their policies, through historical decision making and legacies, school rules. We've seen like the expulsion and exclusion rates of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children are really high. An Aboriginal student is 3 times more likely to be suspended or expelled from South Australian education site than their peers. And so, you know, there are systemic issues as well. And education is not, I think a lot of people don't always understand that schools and early learning sites are institutions and have their own systems that are built on histories and legacies that have existed within this country since colonisation. And so we need to also be addressing them too. That will support, you know, children and young people to engage in education in really equitable ways, and in ways where hopefully they won't be experiencing racism every day. So it kind of leads nicely, I think, Jasmine, to my next question, which is, why is it important to centre the experiences of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people when we're talking about and teaching about racism in Australia?
Yeah, so just going off of your comment before, you know, Natalie, about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children are 3 times more likely to experience, you know, an exclusion or an expulsion within schools. And, you know, it's really hard when you hear, you know, data that comes out like that. And, you know, we know that particularly within education, it's been hard to see ourselves reflected in the curriculum over the years. And, you know, if we're looking from a historical perspective, you know, we're only just, you know, within the Australian curriculum now, it is now mandatory that teachers teach Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives, and it's embedded into your planning within, you know, your classroom. So what we're seeing is that it's so important when we need to centre, you know, particularly the experiences of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, because of the past injustices. You know, we are now able to understand, okay, this has happened previously, and this is why things are the way that they are today, whether it's to do with health or education, closing the gap. And, you know, the list goes on. And it's just, you know, when I sit back and think about, you know, why is it important, you know, to share these experiences, people need to be able to reflect, I think, on what's previously happened, so that they're able to understand. And sometimes that does take teachers and educators, particularly unlearning something that they might have learnt growing up. And, you know, it's putting aside the biased assumptions that people might have as well, and really taking into that historical context, but also this is due to colonization, and this is how we are going to move forward, and we do need to have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people a part of that decision-making process, but also linking that back into racism within educational sites as well. We sometimes, that biasness, it does come into play, particularly with teachers and educators, because they haven't had that education growing up. And, I even think of my own education, and I went through schooling in the 2000s, and, there was not a lot of history that was covered on Australian history, specifically Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history. And, unless we understand what's happened in order to make decisions that impact Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we're really, we're making those decisions based on assumptions. And I think that's why, we do need to centre these experiences around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, because we want to provide the best opportunities for our young people. And, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, children, they play an important part of education. And, they access education sites all across Australia, here in South Australia as well. And it's important for them to feel safe and secure and feel as though they belong, to their classroom, to their school, and that their families also feel safe in that aspect as well. Because when we're putting our children in the hands of a school or an education site, we expect that they're cared for, and that, racism isn't going to come into play, or, that our children are safe from racial comments as well. So this is why it's so important that teachers are equipped, that they can pick up this hard copy. I've got one right here as well. But it's just so, I just feel it's so instrumental. We can make such a difference, educators all across South Australia and Australia. And it just takes, the conversation to start and to happen, and to engage in that dialogue, and for schools to really take this on board, and, changing your policies in schools to ensure that, when racism does occur, what are we going to do about it?
Yeah, I think it's such like an important place to start, that we really need to think about, like when we centre Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives within this work, we're always going to, I guess, create teachers who then have the skills and are able to then look at other communities. But really, Aboriginal people are the first people to exist in Australia, and we need to honour that by making sure that any work that we do has Aboriginal people and their, children and young people at the centre of this work. I just also wanted to touch on a point that you made, Jasmine, about I guess like the education that we had, and like the things that we learned about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures. I always tell the story. I started my schooling in the late 80s, and then I think I would have been in high school in late 90s, early 2000s. And we had an Australian studies course that we all had to participate in. It was one of our like mandated year 10 subjects. And up until that point, I don't think I'd learned a single thing about Aboriginal culture or Aboriginal history within my schooling life, and was really excited to see what I would learn. And in Australian studies, we watched Crocodile Dundee 1 and 2. That was our Australian studies. So a lot of us have been really let down and betrayed by the education system. And that in itself is a foundation for racism within a system and within an institution. When you don't value the history, you're erasing it, you're removing it, we talk about things like Captain Cook discovering Australia, and those kinds of foundations that are built on theft and dispossession create kind of narratives for who we are today and how we view Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And so I think particularly as well, myself as a non-Aboriginal person and a white person living in Australia, I have a responsibility to really, build my own knowledge and capacity within this work, and relearn. Unlearn and relearn are like my favorite. I noticed that you said that, Jazz. I was like, yes, I love when people say unlearn, because you've learned a lot of stuff that is factually incorrect, and but it can be really hard when your kind of schooling is built upon that. So unlearning that takes some time, and then relearning can really help you in your anti-racism journey. I really liked that you talked a bit about responsibilities, Jasmine, and I just wanted to, I guess, expand on that a bit more. Like, what responsibilities do teachers, principals, directors of early learning sites, educators, any staff really working in education, what responsibilities do they have to engage in anti-racism work?
Yeah, we say reconciliation is everybody's business. I think anti-racism is also everybody's business as well. And particularly, educators, we have that responsibility to educate young people in our classrooms and in our schools and our sites. It starts by ensuring that when a racism incident occurs, that, we're not just fobbing it off as bullying or, calling it something that it's not. And I think time and time again, there are many educators who, don't even refer to racism as racism. It's almost been taboo for so long that we're not calling it out for what it is. And I think, it starts with actually naming it for what it is. And yes, this was a racial comment. It was made by a student or a teacher or someone, within the school site. And, I think it's taking it seriously, because we want to be able to create these culturally safe environments for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and all children. And I think that when you have principals and leadership staff who take this seriously, you then see the school site. And, these are the schools that, and I feel that they do stand out because they're taking this seriously, and they want to create a school that they know that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, they can feel safe, but all children can feel safe knowing that when they attend the school setting, that they feel safe, their families feel safe sending them to school, but then they also feel safe in the sense that families can feel at ease knowing that it will be dealt with appropriately as well. And if we're going up into, head office, what does that responsibility look like? I think it's actually changing policies, and ensuring that we do have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people involved in reviewing that policy, and what does, it's a standalone policy. I think that's what it needs to be. And, we're not putting it underneath anything else, but, and when this is dealt with, we need to ensure that the department or, your, whether you are from a private sector or Catholic sector as well, that, that this policy is then changed and then implemented across all of your sites, and that everyone's aware of it. And I think that you do need to see that come from the top, and then that needs to fluctuate down out into your sites across South Australia, but then also more broadly across Australia as well?
Yeah, I think if anybody heard anything today, like I think not just having these documents, like an anti-racism policy is necessary, an anti-racism strategy is really necessary in being able to um, in being able to engage people within the work, but you also need to have plan of how people get across that, because it's so frustrating going into sites and seeing like these beautiful, really well constructed and thoughtful ideas, and then the piece of like communicating it with their teams, with staff taking it up and seeing it as their responsibility. That's the piece that's missing. And so they just become dusty pieces of paper that sit on the shelf and don't do anything.
And I just want to add in, Natalie, as well, we don't see this as being something that's added on to the teacher's load, but embedded into your everyday teaching and learning within the classroom, or within your school. What can you do to ensure that anti-racism is built into, it might be your school values, or it might be built, or you might prioritize it within your professional development for your staff as well. And I think there's so many ways to ensure that anti-racism is embedded into your site.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think too many people view this work as being an add-on or something that sits outside of our regular work. So we have our teaching work that we need to do, and our curriculum that we need to teach to. But then we do reconciliation work or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories. It happens outside of that. It happens as an additional thing or an extra. And anti-racism often is the same. And these things can be, as you said, embedded within your day-to-day practice. So if you're working in a school, the cross-curriculum priority actually requires you to weave Aboriginal cultures and histories throughout all of your planning and all of your teaching. And there's no reason why there aren't other ways, even outside of the cross-curriculum priority, where you can engage Aboriginal culture and Aboriginal history as part of that. We've seen like things like Findon High School. I always use them as an example. They must be getting so sick of me, but they did like a garner shield within their schoolyard, and they use that as part of their woodworking lessons to be able to show their students things like how you treat wood and how you keep that tree alive when you're cutting a piece out of it, and then how you look after and dry out the piece that you've cut. And so these are cultural practices that are easily embedded within work, and that's anti-racism work, because it's actually understanding this deep and rich history that existed before colonization, and our support of that can kind of continue that to keep going. I wanted to mention as well, when we talk about responsibilities, I think it's so, so important to also acknowledge that there are two kind of major documents, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and then also the UN Declaration on the Rights of the Child. And so, we have documents like our curriculum, our professional teaching standards, quality improvement plans, the early years learning framework, the Australian curriculum. These are all things that tell us what we need to do. But those UN declarations also tell you what your responsibilities are in order to uphold the rights of children and young people that are in your sites, and how you can act in ethical ways where you honour the rights of children and young people and their families. And I think a lot of people forget that they exist, or they're not sure that they're relevant to their work. And I would just like to stress that they are relevant, and that they can actually support you in thinking about how you might be able to honour the rights of children and young people as well. I do have one more question, but before I do that, I've noticed there's one in the chat, Jasmine. So, as someone that works with a number of sites, see and hear of people who do nothing because they're too afraid of doing or saying the wrong thing and being racist as a result. How do I support them to begin this journey?
My advice would be, don't be a bystander. And I think, that's probably something that I kind of live by as well. And, I personally, I don't think we should sit on people who are making comments like this, particularly in education sites. That's really concerning. And, and I think that you need to bring it to the attention of the right people. And I would be escalating that, because, everyone deserves, people deserve to come to work in a culturally safe space that is free from anti-racism, and our children deserve to go to school also in a culturally safe space, where there is no racism. And, I think particularly, I think it's supporting those people, to say something. And, while they might not feel comfortable expressing what is being said, maybe to leadership or their line manager, I think finding someone who they are comfortable to speak to, it might even be reaching out to, if you're in South Australia, I'm not sure, but your ACEO or a SETO, and then they could also escalate it through their channels as well. And I think that would be my first point of call. But also, yeah, it's really encouraging them not to be a bystander in this scenario, because I think for too long we've probably been bystanders in racism. And, not to say that everyone is, but there are times where, we hear the comments and we know internally that's not right and that doesn't sound right, and it just doesn't sit right. But I think it's having the courage to speak up and to just say that, this isn't right. And, it makes me feel uncomfortable, but it's not fair on the children in that setting as well. So that would be, I think, supporting, those people to say something. And, I think that would be the first instance. Natalie, I don't know if you've got something to build on from that.
I was just going to say, like with any anti-racism work, it's like being a bystander. There's no perfection in being able to do this work. You can strive to be a perfect anti-racist educator and you will fail because it's hard and you're going to make mistakes, particularly if you are a white person working in schools, which like the education sector is filled with a lot of non-Aboriginal white people. You're going to make mistakes. You need to get comfortable with feeling discomfort, because there's going to be times when you need to reflect on decisions you've made or things you've said, and it's going to be clunky. And when racism happens, you may have read all the books and you may have a brilliant idea in your head, and then how that actually comes out in the moment is something completely different. But I guess what makes you more confident is just that continued engagement. So we use a quote in the book and in our research from a really incredible writer called Ibram X. Kendi, who wrote How to Be Anti-Racist. And one of the things we talk about is anti-racism is like a peelable name tag. So when you kind of aren't thinking about it, or you're not making a conscious effort, it can kind of peel off, or you can forget about it. But really, that kind of ongoing effort and ongoing commitment to anti-racism is what's going to help you to build your confidence. So the other part of that quote is, no one strives to be racist or anti-racist. They can only, no one is racist or anti-racist. They can only strive to be one or the other through that kind of ongoing work. I would also say to like supporting someone to start this journey, use our book. We're really proud of it. And it's, you know, again, it's not going to change the world, but it is a really good starting point for getting people involved. And yeah, just, I think just like helping people to understand that making mistakes is part of learning. I mean, I've been working in this space for a long time, and I'm sure that if you asked some of the community members that I work with, that they could point out times that I've made mistakes, and I'm still, you know, standing here and, you know, am able to continue to participate and support education in this space because of those relationships, because people still trust me because I kind of wear my mistakes and choose to use them as learning opportunities. So yeah, I hope that helps. Um, excuse me. I think that kind of leads actually really nicely to the final question that I had, which was like, what can education sites do to engage in anti-racism and also build sites that are combating racism every day? So what sorts of strategies can we offer people, I guess, Jasmine?
I think and I've got a few notes written down here. Firstly, I would suggest if you're a school or a site that doesn't have a reconciliation action plan, is to look into having one of those for your site. Because one of the actions on there is to take action against racism. And I think, if this is something that your school wants to go on the journey of reconciliation, it's a great tool around for accountability, but also you have people, a working group who are able to drive reconciliation in your school or your site. And if you prioritize those actions and you have a group who are passionate about taking action against racism, that can actually be really powerful, I think, within an educational setting, when you have a group of people who are driving this change within a school site. But also, and I think every year this week comes around, it's gone from Harmony Day to Harmony Week. But I think actually, there is a multicultural lens, within Harmony Week, but also calling it for what it is as well. It coincides with the United Nations International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And I think, children are never too old to learn about the history behind it. But also, I think it's really important that students understand that this is actually where Harmony Day a week has come from. And, it does coincide with that day. And I believe we are one of the few, if not only, countries who actually don't call it for the day that it is. And and I think as a school, you can really make or you can take charge in this aspect, and you can use it as a learning opportunity for your school and for your site to really engage in what the day actually means. So that's some of the things that I was thinking about. But also, and I talk about this with schools a lot, but it's actually dedicating time within your weekly planning or your staff meetings. And, it might even be picking up this resource. And, for term 3 or term 4, for 10 minutes each staff meeting, we're actually going to unpack, and we're going to, as a learning, professional learning team, a PLT team, whatever you call them, we're going to devote to learning and reading the resource. Or it might be, okay, we're going to, do an activity from this resource, and we're actually going to come back to our staff meeting, and we're going to share our new learnings, what worked, what didn't work. And I think those, I've had a school recently that's actually prioritized that in their staff meetings, and they're doing wonderful work in this space. And, all that it took was we're going to prioritize this. And for accountability to happen, we're actually going to embed it into our staff meetings so that we're accountable to each other as a staff. But then also, it's that sharing of, well, this worked, but what could we do better next time? Or what could we tweak to ensure that, our students are getting the best out of this? So those are probably, some suggestions that I had. Natalie, did you have any others?
Yeah, look, really, I would just be encouraging people to look at our book, engaging in our workshops and contacting Reconciliation SA if you want to engage more in anti-racism work. I'm glad that you brought up the Harmony Day debacle. John Howard, when he was in power, he did some damage, and one of those things was renaming the day of eliminating racism to Harmony Day. And I know like a lot of teachers and educators really enjoy celebrating that day, but it's important to look at the roots of it and the fact that that's not what it always used to be. And these are examples of where the system changes things to make them more palatable, but stops us having these really direct, important conversations about racism. I've also got a question from the chat, which I think would be good to talk about, Jasmine. Someone's just mentioned like that there's a lot of programs that exist within their school, like SASTA, Clontarf, those kinds of things that are specifically exist to support equity and equitable practices and equitable achievements, I guess, for Aboriginal students. But there's not enough information or kind of reading between the lines, I would say that maybe also staff and other students don't understand the purpose of them and I guess, how you might address something like that. Something that I would say, like kind of straight off the bat, is like looking at our resource and supporting people to understand the impacts that racism and historical legacies have had on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and how that directly links to these kind of equity programs that are supporting Aboriginal students to still achieve the same outcomes as their peers. But I wondered if you had anything else to comment on that, Jasmine.
That's a tough one. Even I find those conversations really difficult. And, I think it does come back down to education. And I think, and we're talking about high school students here, when they understand from a historical perspective of the injustices that have occurred since colonisation and, understanding that Aboriginal children actually start behind their non-Aboriginal peers when they start school, and, that literacy and numeracy for Aboriginal students, we're not starting at the same point as non-Aboriginal children when Aboriginal children start their educational journey. And, it's almost like we're continually playing a catch-up game, to be at level with non-Aboriginal people or children within the education system. And, there's a lot of things that come into play, and I think really understanding that what we're trying to do is ensure that Aboriginal students within South Australia or across Australia, that they are able to access the same education as other students, but they're also being able to show their learning in different ways as well. And for some people, that might not be sitting in a classroom. There are other avenues for our young people to be able to show their learning, whether it is through a SASTA program or, it is through Clontarf or something like that. it's very similar to it's accessing education through a different avenue, I guess, where we're all here to achieve the same thing, but it does come down to really understanding how those historical injustices and, that intergenerational trauma and, that's real, and, how it's passed down to generation, and, the effects of that. And yeah, I think it's a very tough one, but I think having a conversation with your students as to why these programs are set up, is the most important thing. Because have teachers really sat down and explained, this is what SASTA is, or this is what CONTAF is, and and I think that's really important as well, because other students might see these programs up and running, but do they actually understand what they're providing for Aboriginal students? So, yeah, and I think, that's probably, it does come back down to education and really, and I think over time, like, I've had friends, non-Aboriginal friends who, it's that journey of unlearning and relearning, why these programs are put in place. Why is there funding towards, Aboriginal education, or why is there, these policies that have been developed, and I think it comes down to education and having those conversations.
Yeah, I think engaging in the Reconciliation Action Plan process and looking at Reconciliation Australia's 5 dimensions of reconciliation is really helpful to the dimension around equality and equity, and helping your students to just understand what equity really looks like and what that means. There's also, I think, like when it comes to this, you need to kind of look bigger than what's happening in your school, and see like kind of, helping students to unpack things like how media covers Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's experiences in the world. We probably, just an interesting anecdote that might help with this situation is colleague of mine and I did some workshops with young students. They were all between 10 and 13 years old. And we just asked them about reconciliation. So what they thought about it, things that they were maybe already doing. And one of the responses from a 10-year-old was, I think it's unfair that Aboriginal people get special stuff and get free stuff. And this was post-referendum. And there was a lot of really, destructive misinformation and disinformation that was being sent out during that campaign, and continues to happen online on Facebook and social media and in the news. And so it's just like really helping your students to criticize things that are being fed to them and stories that are being told. And, really being critical of particularly mainstream media can sit within this work, because that's where some of this kind of messaging comes from. And, helping them understand that they're not missing out, that actually it is about equity and allowing people to have the same outcomes. So, yeah, it is complicated, but, I think talking about equity is great for all students in this work anyway, but also undoing like maybe some of where that stereotyping or where some of those myths are coming from as well, because I feel like that feeds these kinds of ideas as well. Are there any more questions? I think we're past the time that I said that the webinar would end today. But if anyone else has a question, I think we've still got a little bit of time. Otherwise, I was going to just finish up on another Luke Carroll video. All right. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to finish off with a final video from Luke Carroll. I think this was his final thought. So we did some recording with Luke when we did that other video that you watched, and we've done several videos, but I just think this is a good place to end.
You know, I'm extremely passionate about breaking down the boundaries of us as a people, as a nation. Racism, I've experienced it, my family have experienced it. I know how harsh it can be, how hurtful it could be. And I think if we can educate ourselves, learn about ourselves, learn about our differences. Yes, we are different. You know, we are a nation that is made up of many different cultures, but we need to celebrate that. The divide that happens in this country, and I see it, our young people, they come together. They're our future. So for me, the future is bright, but there are generations that have gone before us that haven't got that experience, that education of coming together as one. I think it's vital. I want to be a proud Australian. I'm a proud Aboriginal man from the oldest continuing culture in this world, and that's something that all Australians should celebrate, but we should also celebrate all the beautiful other cultures that have been here. I want to be a better Australian. I want to be more proud to be Australian. And I think through education, through eradicating racism, through anti-racism education, I think we can be the best nation in the world. But we can't be lazy about this. You know, we have to meet each other halfway and walk together as one. Now do it, you mob.
All right. Well, I guess that's kind of it for us today. Please feel free, I think, to email me. You should have received an email from me with this link. If you didn't, I'm sure I'll share it in the coming days. Thanks so much for attending this evening to hear about the resource. Something that would be very helpful for us is if you share the link to the resource, tell everybody. If you're working in education and they don't know about it, let them know. Get out there and talk about racism. You know, we need to get people to start thinking about this and really addressing it within their sites. And yeah, Reconciliation SA are doing workshops. We're doing a lot of work in this space. So it will only be doing bigger and better things the next time you hear from us. So thank you all for attending.